Well, I'll say that as I was reading Hegel, rereading Hegel for these last two modules, um, I was struck again, and I'm used to this happening, just by um, how deep he is as a thinker, how much he's even thought of all the criticisms we might have of him and incorporated that into his philosophy, so that it becomes very difficult to negate Hegel, right? Because he expects negation, and even formally incorporates the logic of negation into his system. So it's as though, in contradicting Hegel, you're also confirming Hegel. um, he's a very deep thinker, and even though my own, I guess, inclinations lead me to prefer Schelling's approach, which I find more rooted in nature, obviously, and also, though, in the poetic imagination or the creative imagination. I'm more of a romantic at heart, and so I can't help but have a leaning in Schelling's direction, and I appreciate Schelling's critiques of Hegel. But at the same time, I always find it. I always find that I need to kind of be careful in my critiques of Hegel, because when I actually read him again and consider his thought deeply, I just see how deep he is, how complex his thinking is, and how close it is to Schelling in so many ways. Um, so I've also been in dialogue with Sean Kelly over the years about the relationship between Schelling and Hegel, and Sean has taught me a lot and kept me from exaggerating or caricaturing Hegel in my critiques of him. Um, so, I'm curious how you guys feel about the relationship between these two thinkers. Hegel is usually, given more attention by historians of philosophy, and I think for that reason alone, I feel justified in trying to champion Schelling a bit more, just to bring him back into the conversation. There's so much about the postmodern, post-structural school of thought in the 20th century that does inherit Hegel. I think I shared in response to one of maybe it was Jules' comment in Module 7, the famous lines from Michel Foucault about Hegel, where he says something like, as soon as we think we've finally left Hegel behind and escaped his dialectic, we turn the next corner and see that he's standing there waiting for us, laughing. So there's a way in which will never be done with Hegel, and it's naive to think we could escape, and so we may as well celebrate him. And there's some ways in which, like Ralph Waldo Emerson says of Plato, that all the best refutations of Plato's ideas are in Plato's dialogues already. And in a similar way, Hegel has kind of already thought of all the criticisms of his thought and incorporated them into the process of consciousness's coming to absolute knowledge of itself. The criticisms of Hegel's position are like already part of his position. So it becomes very difficult to escape his clutches, basically. I think someone else, maybe it was Derrida, who said that the only way to refute Hegel is through laughter, which I'm not sure is actually a refutation, but it's sort of like you can't even engage with him if you're going to try to refute him. You just have to just do something else. try to imagine a totally new form of philosophy. And in some ways, that's what Schelling does with what he calls, his philosophy of mythology and revelation is also referred to as a positive philosophy, and Schelling calls Hegel's philosophy negative philosophy. And positive philosophy wouldn't be possible without having first gone through negative philosophy, but in a sense, Schelling's trying to have a new beginning for philosophy after Hegel that goes back to that experience of wonder at the sheer fact that anything exists at all, rather than as with Hegel, getting caught in the attempt to deduce what there is and to conceptually catalog the essences of everything. It seems that's where Hegel ends up with his method of philosophy in an encyclopedia of all knowledge, right? Cataloging the essences of things or what things are, whereas Schelling's positive philosophy is an attempt to return to the fact that we exist and our experience of wonder in the face of just that sheer contingency, and that experience of existence itself in a really existential sense. I mean, Schelling is in some ways the first existentialist. He influences Kierkegaard, who was at Schelling's final lectures in Berlin in the early 1840s. He's returning to a sense of existence and saying that existence precedes essence in so many ways. That's one way of describing what Schelling's positive philosophy is. And it's out of that confrontation with the mystery of existence that he develops a philosophy that takes myth seriously and looks to the history of myth as a kind of evolution of consciousness, he looks at the history of myth as an archaeology of consciousness, you might say, that allows us to see the gradual evolution of consciousness through these various mythic forms. And for Schelling, that culminates myth, the history of myth culminates in a revelation, which of course is the Christian revelation. And I think, there are ways of reading what Schelling's doing that aren't so Christocentric, I guess. We just have to be a bit more imaginative and pluralistic and planetary in our understanding of what he's talking about. But, we can think in terms of the supermind with Aurobindo instead of just in terms of Christ. That's really, I think, the only tradition that Schelling knew inside and out. And so, of course, the culmination of his philosophy comes in Christian terms, but we don't need to necessarily limit ourselves to interpreting it in just that way. But unlike Hegel, who thought that philosophy left myth behind and religion behind, Schelling is saying, no, philosophy has to work with the material of myth and with the material of religious experience, because without that, it can't ever claim truth. And so Schelling's really trying to preserve myth and religion in his pursuit of a philosophical absolute, whereas Hegel is way more willing to say that we've evolved out of a religious form or a mythic form of consciousness and can just access the truth purely conceptually, purely scientifically. So it's one way of trying to tease out the difference between Schelling and Hegel. It strikes me that one area where Hegel, I think, is a deeper thinker than Schelling is in terms of thinking about history, specifically human history and the various sort of socio-political forms of organizing that humanity has moved through and how those have affected our consciousness and our philosophy. Schelling was way more concerned with nature and natural history, and Hegel's more concerned with human history. And it's almost like for Hegel, in order to get at nature outside of the human social sphere, we first need to understand the history of the human social sphere because the ideas that each period of human history, the ideas that shape each period of human history are mediating our awareness and our understanding of nature. And so we can't understand what nature is until we've sort of worked through the history of ideas of nature as various human societies have held them. Whereas Schelling had this view that, well, we have intuitive, immediate contact with the natural world and the living dimension of, you know, the evolutionary process. And so Schelling wanted to kind of bypass the mediation of language and society and human history to just get directly to nature. And Hegel was like, well, wait a minute, like, you're embedded in a society that has a whole history of interpretation of what nature even is. And until we've understood that history, you know, we can't just gain immediate access to how nature is in itself. And that's a pretty, that critique has some weight, you know, so anyone who wants to affirm Schelling's view of nature has to contend with that. I think there are, you know, good reasons for Schelling's perspective, but Hegel's, the way that Hegel gives so much weight to the sort of social construction of nature, we might say nowadays, I think also needs to be reckoned with. So we are nature itself philosophizing, but we're also thousands of years of human interpretation of nature philosophizing, right? Because we're so kind of enveloped in our ideas of the earth and of other living things and the human place within all of that, we fail to really contact, like it's so difficult for people apparently to understand climate change.
Yeah.
Because we're so filtered by political ideology. You know, it's not like scientists always sort of speak directly for nature, right? Scientists also have their own biases, and you know, they're situated in a certain position in our society, and they have a certain perspective that's mediated. But it seems like Schelling's position has more to teach us in this moment than Hegel's position, because we really need to find a way to make contact again with the non-human natural world, because we're so trapped inside of our social constructs that we're destroying that natural world. We need to consider both perspectives, you know, Hegel's perspective and Schelling's perspective, because one can be like an environmentalist but have a kind of naive view of what nature is, and in that case, it's important to take a Hegelian approach to try to understand how that idea of nature was constructed historically, so that, you know, we want to make sure that we have a genuinely authentic connection to nature, and not an overly romanticized or an overly rationalized conception of nature. Because if we're, you know, a scientific materialist, our view of nature is in that sense inauthentic, I would say, but it's also inauthentic to view nature as just not, you know, instead of viewing nature as a dead machine and viewing it as a kind of, you know, harmonious, balanced circle of life where, you know, everything is provided for and there's no suffering or death, because clearly that's an inauthentic view of nature too. Nature is full of death. Nature is full of suffering. Nature is violent. There's catastrophe and destruction, you know, right alongside creation and harmony. So whatever harmony exists in nature is balanced by chaos, right? And so getting to an authentic view of nature without projecting our social constructs onto it, it's not an easy task, right? So yeah, I think there's something we can learn from Hegel and something we can learn from Schelling in this moment as we try to reconcile ourselves with an ecological crisis. It's we've got to thread the needle there. There's so Hegel gave some lectures on the history of philosophy, and I was tempted this module 8 to have you read some of that, but I didn't want to overwhelm you. But in his lectures on the history of philosophy, Hegel says this about Schelling. He says, in the various presentations of his views, Schelling on each occasion began again from the beginning, because, as we may see, what went before did not satisfy him. He has ever pressed on to seek a new form. And thus, he had tried various forms and various terminologies in succession without ever setting forth one complete and consistent whole. Hegel continues, it is not feasible then to go into details respecting what is called the philosophy of Schelling, even if time permitted, for it is not yet a scientific whole organized in all its branches, since it rather consists in certain general elements which do not fluctuate with the rest of his opinions. Schelling's philosophy must still be regarded as in process of evolution and has not yet ripened into fruit. We can hence give only a general idea of it. And then he goes on to summarize each of Schelling's major books. So what for Hegel is sort of problematic about Schelling's philosophy, that it's still in process of evolution. From my point of view, that's actually one of the merits of Schelling's perspective, because Hegel wants to achieve the end and the final completed system of all knowledge. And it just seems to me that as soon as one claims to do that and actually like publish the book, the encyclopedia that possesses all knowledge, that the next day someone thinks of something new. And how could you ever possibly imagine that you could encompass everything into one finished system? I think if the nature of the universe is a cosmogenesis, then the nature of philosophy should be to remain in a continual process of evolution, right? So I just found it interesting the way that Hegel's criticizing Schelling is actually the reasons he criticizes Schelling are the reasons that I prefer Schelling. I'm a process philosopher. Schelling's a process philosopher. Hegel has plenty of process in his philosophy too, but it's process with a pre-established end in mind. It's like he wants to achieve absolute knowledge and complete a system, whereas I think Schelling and other process thinkers like Whitehead are trying to convey a philosophy and a method of philosophizing that is open-ended and isn't seeking completion, but is seeking authentic participation in what will always be an ongoing evolutionary process. I really appreciate Hegel highlighting exactly why I prefer Schelling's perspective in his attempt to critique Schelling. I wish Sean was here to defend Hegel. If I get carried away criticizing Hegel, just stop me and let me get my balance again. There's something more Apollonian about Hegel's approach and something more Dionysian about Schelling's approach. Mm-hmm. In that when Hegel talks about an abyss, it's something he wants to escape. He wants to find some solid ground. to build his system on. Whereas when Schelling encounters the abyss, he says, hang on, this is exactly what we need to be looking at. And he dives in head first, maybe heart first, actually. And the abyss, in German, the term is Abgrund, which is like the absence of ground. And if there's, a foundation to Hegel's system, which is kind of like the logic, right? He has his three spheres: the logic, the philosophy of logic, which is in some sense the mind of God, and then there's the realm of, or the sphere of spirit, and the sphere of nature. But it's the realm of logic for Hegel that's the ground of nature and spirit, even though he wants like a free circulation between these three spheres, this trinity. At the end of the day, he begins with logic and tries to derive everything from that. Whereas Schelling isn't so much philosophizing from a ground. He doesn't have a foundation. At the base of his philosophy, there's a fountain, and it's this abyss. But when you dive into the abyss, you realize there's no ground, so you're not really falling. You're kind of flying. You may as well think of yourself as flying. And so Schelling's trying to fly and philosophize in a groundless way, so that, as Hegel said in each of his books, he's beginning again. He's not satisfied with what he's already published in the past. He's trying to, continually advance creatively beyond what has been said before. And in some sense, that's frustrating, right? Like if you ask, well, what do you really think, Schelling? He's like, well, I need to discover it again in each moment that you ask me that. So, in studying Schelling's chronology, there is a sense in which I don't know that we can understand logically his transition, after the identity philosophy, into what becomes the philosophy of the positive philosophy. I think part of the story is personal and biographical in the sense that Schelling went through a very difficult period when he was falling in love with Caroline, who at the time was still married to one of the Schlegel brothers, Wilhelm. And it's unclear whether he was more in love with Caroline or with her daughter, Auguste. And, Richards tells this story for us, where first Auguste dies, and then several years later, after Wilhelm Schlegel magnanimously just divorces Caroline and lets Schelling marry her because they were in love, then Caroline dies. And it's right around that time, 1807 is when she dies, that Schelling's philosophy really takes a turn, and it's not even clear that he's still an idealist. His philosophy of nature already hinted that there was more to his thought than just could be captured by the title idealism. But, in 1807, he, right as Caroline was dying, it's some historians believe he was working on that book with Caroline that's called Clara, or on the spirit world's relationship with nature. And it's a beautifully written literary dialogue about a woman who has lost her husband and struggling to understand where people go when they die, basically. And then in 1809, Schelling writes his book, Philosophical Investigations into the Essence of Human Freedom. And that's where he really starts to dive into the abyss and try to understand the nature of human existence in terms of freedom, which is not freedom as liberal political theorists understood it, but freedom as a crisis in our being that forces us to make an really pre-conscious decision between goodness and evil, and a decision that we're making again in each moment of our existence. And so rather than say that we have freedom as like something that we wield to make choices in the marketplace or whatever, freedom has us. And what characterizes the unique responsibility and intensity of human existence is this crisis that freedom forces us to confront. And it's a crisis because, Schelling will say what we experience as freedom, the divine experiences as life. And in the divine, in God, life is the circulation of these potencies that Schelling describes of light and dark are in equilibrium with each other. So, the divine doesn't need to choose or decide between light and dark, or what in the human mode is good and evil. The divine is in harmony with itself. And yet something about the moment of creation breaks that harmony in the divine, and it spills out into human existence. And now all of a sudden, that harmony between light and dark isn't assured anymore, because the human being is free. We have to decide to be good or to be evil. And, Schelling's philosophy from this point forward takes place in the context of a pretty profound theodicy, a study of evil and how it is. If he's still, a believer in some kind of theism, but it's not a theism where God is separate from the world. It's not a theism where God just creates the world, ex nihilo, or where God could have not created the world. It's a theism where, God couldn't but have created the world, and in creating the world, God really risks something. Schelling wants a theology and a story of creation where God puts God's self at risk in creating the world, and then that human beings need to help God in in redeeming the creation. And so it's not clear that this redemption is a foregone conclusion either. Whereas there's more of a sense of providence in Hegel's understanding of the dialectic and the march of history. It's not as clear for Schelling. There's a real sense of tragedy in his philosophy after, Caroline dies, from basically 1807 onward. So again, like, how do we understand that shift in his thought? Well, he may have been a more kind of optimistic, energetic idealist who really believed that the human being could come to know the inner powers of nature and raise them to full self-consciousness. And then he experienced death and loss, the loss of a loved one, two loved ones. And that changed him. He wasn't as optimistic anymore. And he had a real sense of tragedy that he felt compelled to incorporate into his philosophical view. And, there are plenty of interpreters of Hegel who read him not as saying that, like, he brought an end to history, but that try to kind of qualify that by saying he at least brought history to an end in thought and rather than in reality, because obviously history continued, and Marx came along, and Marx had his own view of the dialectic of history that also had a certain necessity or teleology built into it, and that hasn't panned out in the way that Marx expected quite yet, and it's not clear if the workers are finally going to wake up one day. I'm not so sure. but there's a way in which Hegel was making a slightly less grandiose claim than it may seem he was making, in claiming that, with the idea of freedom that was just being worked out in the early 1800s after the French Revolution, and the American Revolution, that Hegel was saying, just conceptually, looking at history, he couldn't think of any way to improve upon the ideas that are, included in these new constitutions that were being written, in the U.S. Constitution, for example. The idea of a state there whose role is to protect the freedom of individuals. He saw in that at least the ideal structure of what a utopian society would look like if it were fully realized. And he knew that the idea of freedom hadn't been fully realized yet in actual history, but he had worked it out conceptually, and he didn't think that his conceptualization of freedom and of the ideal state could ever be improved upon. It was just a matter of history catching up to what he had thought. So, still hubristic to think that he figured it all out in his mind, but he wasn't saying the even more absurd thing that, like, history ended when he had the thought. He knows that history continued, but there was a sense in which he'd worked out the logical structure of its end before it had ended. Well, we might have to, read Hegel against Hegel, in the sense that what he taught us about the dialectic, he contradicts in claiming that there is an end, even if it's a conceptual end to history. It may be that we need to sublate Hegel. And that's kind of what Marx does, right? And a lot of postmodern thinkers are carrying forward that dialectical mode of thought, but with the full recognition of its the limitation inherent in the dialectic, which is that it doesn't bring you to any final conclusions. It negates everything. And in some ways, the postmodern situation is that we're left with only irony, because we can't believe anything that anybody says. Everything can be contradicted. So there's another sense in which, if we do let the dialectic run wild, we end up kind of, burning the whole thing down. So certainly, though, it's a potent, and it proves to be a world historical mode of thinking, which is to say that it wasn't just a mode of thinking, it was politically actualized in some sense, and it catalyzed revolutions. I mean, so part of the story about why, and we'll read more about this in Module 9, part of the reason that Schelling was invited to Berlin to give his final lectures of his life in the 1840s was, Hegel had died. He had been teaching at the University of Berlin, and he died in 1831. And there were some pretty radical followers of Hegel who were beginning to get politically rowdy, and the leadership in Germany and in Berlin wanted Schelling to come critique Hegel and calm the revolutionaries who were threatening to mobilize against the leadership. And Schelling didn't exactly do what they hoped, but in a sense, he only further inflamed things, because when he gave these lectures, who was in the audience? Kierkegaard, I mentioned, but also Engels was there. And, after Engels attended these lectures, Marx was writing to him, asking for a report, immediately, like, what did Schelling say? You got to tell me. and other early anarchist thinkers were there, and so they learned from Schelling what the limitations of Hegel's thought were and carried that forward into their own political philosophy. So, Schelling didn't exactly quiet the revolutionary energy there. And in the later, the late 1840s and 1848, right, there were massive revolutions all across Europe. So despite Hegel's claim that, philosophers don't make history, they just interpret history, his ideas ended up shaping history, and continue to. So Hegel didn't, even if he tried to copyright the Dialectic, it's outrun his ownership. There's a way in which, though, it can start to seem like the Dialectic is almost like formulaic, like we can almost expect, a profound thesis to be contradicted by an equally profound antithesis, and then a new synthesis to arise after that. I mean, despite the seeming formulaic nature of it, it's I think we're still surprised each time one of these processes of sublation happens. And Hegel wants to remind us of that, like when we're experiencing the negation of something, whether it's the negation of the worldview or just one of our own individual ideas, it's a real death. And in that moment of contraction and death, like the BPM2 moment in Stan Grof's perinatal matrices, like there's no hope of escaping. And yet only by going through that sense of complete loss do we come out the other side and realize that life goes on, and that there's a kind of cumulative process of growth as we move through these processes of contraction and negation, coming out on the other side we come out more whole somehow. And I think it's surprising every time, and it's frightening every time. It's easy to conceptually think that we understand the process, but then to go through it in actual life is another story. Because it always feels like, wow, maybe we're not going to make it through this time. I really like that metaphor of thinking of this as a kind of interreligious dialogue where we're able to invite all of these thinkers to the table and hear them out and learn from each of them, and not feel the need to choose one or to allow one to defeat the other's arguments. I think with Schelling and with Hegel, there's a real, I think, valiant effort to not approach other philosophers with the need to refute them. I mean, you see Hegel saying this explicitly in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit. And, Schelling has his criticisms of Hegel, but also wants to praise Hegel for, taking what Schelling calls negative philosophy to working it out to its, most elaborate, complete form. And Schelling praises him for that. And Schelling is clear that he couldn't have articulated or realized the importance of what he calls positive philosophy without Hegel's efforts. Mm-hmm. So, and then, I think unfortunately with thinkers like Fichte, there was less of an ability to acknowledge the validity of others' perspectives. Mm. He was very much, a man on a mission who thought that he had figured it out, and anyone who wasn't, who couldn't accept his rendition was missing it. And, you know, I'm not sure what to say about Kant and Goethe in that respect. I think Goethe was just trying to learn as much as he could from anyone who would talk
Yeah.
to him. And um, Kant was just really, um, really worried about overstepping the bounds of what is possible to know. And, you know, his mark, the mark that he wanted to leave on philosophy was to sort of be the guardian of the threshold and say, if you're going to pass uh, through this transcendental limit, you better have, uh, you know, you better have wrestled with the critique of metaphysics that I've put forward. Um, so, you know, Kant was almost taking a step back from philosophy and saying, look, if you want philosophical knowledge, this is what you're going to have to avoid, because this won't give you philosophical knowledge. This will give you illusion. You'll think you've reached the things in themselves, but really you're just reflecting on ideas in your head. Um, and so he set the conditions and made clear what the limitations of an old way of philosophizing were, and then was eager to see what the next generation of philosophers would do with that. Um, and I don't think Kant was really satisfied with where Fichte wanted to go with it. And I think, you know, Kant read some Schelling late in his life and was intrigued, and it inspired further thinking on Kant's part. But yeah, like Kant's the guardian of the threshold. Fichte was the first to break through that threshold, but he was so fixated on his own perspective that he couldn't be in fruitful dialogue with Schelling, as Schelling realized the equal importance of nature. But then with Schelling and Hegel, we really get a sense for a new kind of dialectical philosophizing, or sim philosophy, you might say, where there's a recognition that we need to do this together. Rather than trying to refute one another, we can approach the absolute in concert. You know, when we can each play our instrument and reach that absolute knowledge as a kind of harmony that none of us could produce on our own. I really like, it was, I forget how it was discovered, I think in a letter that Hegel wrote to his wife late in Hegel's life, that was lost and then rediscovered not too long ago, where it was realized, it allowed us to realize that Hegel and Schelling had met again at a bathhouse, where, you know, their friendship was kind of destroyed around 18 well 1806, 1807, when Hegel published the Phenomenology of Spirit. But slightly before that, you know, Schelling had moved from Jena, and they weren't as in close collaboration as they had been in the years earlier. And so they hadn't spoken probably for 20 years. And then they meet at this bathhouse again. And Hegel says they got along like old friends. And it was as though there were no hard feelings between them. It really helps me to hear that. I'm glad that they didn't have any antagonism or animosity towards one another, despite what they said about one another at heated moments in their writings. So, you know, I think there's a real requirement in philosophy, which is literally the friendship with wisdom. We say love of wisdom, but philia is like friendship, where philosophy needs to be pursued with friends. And Schelling and Hegel are a great example of what can be accomplished through that type of pursuit. So we we read the introduction or the preface and the postface, I think, of a book by Eckhart Forster, The 25 Years of Philosophy. And in the meat of that book, Forster really highlights the role that Spinoza played, not only for Schelling and Hegel, but for Goethe as well. So yeah, he's right there at the center. And part of this is, at that moment in history in Germany, Spinoza was extremely controversial because, other thinkers like Lessing, who was a famous philosopher at the time, admitted he admitted to Jacobi that he thought Spinoza was onto something, and that's scandalous because Spinoza is an atheist, right? And Jacobi goes and publishes this, and now it's tarring Lessing's name, at least for some who didn't like Spinoza. And so the hot topic, the hot issue, from the 1790s through, all of the German idealism was like, well, what are we to make of Spinoza? Because it's kind of an outlier in modern philosophy to think in terms of both affirming the preeminence of nature as a law-abiding, causal, mechanistic system, and affirming that nature is God, that nature is in fact in the infinite substance, and that the human mind is one with that. It sort of breaks the categories that modern people are used to thinking in terms of. And that form of pantheism, it just had a lot of potency. And as with any great philosopher, it's very difficult to know exactly what they thought, because it's with the great philosopher, you've got a great philosopher when what spins off of that philosophy are these multiple interpretations that are irreconcilable with one another. They're kind of creative misreadings, you might say. And the whole history of philosophy is full of creative misreadings of predecessors. And, Schelling appreciated Spinoza's intellectual intuition or intellectual understanding of the infinite substance. Hegel appreciated his geometric method. And I think they both wanted to identify with the most radical thinker being discussed in their particular historical milieu and social milieu. If you were identified with Spinoza, it was clear, like, okay, you're a radical, like you're on the edge of thinking, and you're not just content to remain in conformity with traditional ways of thinking. It was cool to be a Spinozist of some sort. Unless you were an older, more conservative person, then you hate Spinoza because he's ruining our pious, humble understanding of God's relationship to human beings in the natural world. But if you want to know more about Spinoza and the details, Eckhart Forster really puts Spinoza at the center in the middle of that book that we read the beginning and the end of. I was trying to whet your appetite with that. Spinoza definitely thought that he knew a thing or two, whereas Socrates claimed he only knew that he didn't know anything. So in that sense, they're different, right? But in the way that Spinoza was excommunicated from his Jewish community, they didn't put him to death, but he was in a sense dead to his community. So and he shares that sense of being exiled with Socrates. But their mode of philosophizing is quite different, I think. Spinoza is claiming to geometrically prove a specific view of the universe, of reality, whereas Socrates isn't. Socrates is more just trying to engage people in dialogue, and simply by asking them simple questions, lead them to a realization that they don't know what they're talking about. So many of the Socratic dialogues end in what's called aporia, right? Which just means they're inconclusive. There's no answers provided. Mm-hmm. There's a great book that I'd recommend if you want to know more about Spinoza. It's called the Courtier and the Heretic, Leibniz, Spinoza, and the Fate of God in the Modern World. It's by Matthew Stewart. I really enjoyed this book. It shows you, it puts Spinoza in his context, his historical context. It's a kind of loose, almost oversimplified summary of his thought. But then it brings in Leibniz and shows how the two of them actually met. Leibniz got a hold of Spinoza's ethics and was, Leibniz didn't want anyone to know he was reading Spinoza, because it was absolutely forbidden for, a good Christian and a good statesman such as Leibniz to be reading such scandalous material. But he was curious because he'd been hearing rumors about this brilliant guy who's carrying the Cartesian philosophy forward. And so Leibniz read Spinoza and then traveled to Amsterdam to meet with Spinoza. They exchanged some letters. And you start to see after this meeting that Leibniz's philosophy is changing. And he's not acknowledging it, but beginning to incorporate some of, at least his own spin on some of Spinoza's ideas, trying to find a way to preserve freedom, though, in a way that Spinoza's philosophy didn't seem to, at least not, I guess in Spinoza, our only freedom is to love our fate. Whereas Leibniz wanted to somehow preserve a truer sense of freedom alongside the sense of divine predestination or a divinely preordained order. And it's a thrilling read because it sort of dramatizes history in a way that I think is really entertaining. Matthew Stewart definitely prefers Spinoza over Leibniz, because Stewart's clearly trying to say that Spinoza was the forerunner to secular, atheistic, materialistic thought, and that he was an early proponent of, what we think of nowadays as a secular, democratic political order, whereas Stewart reads Leibniz as a kind of medieval holdover who's trying to desperately cling to the old theology in the context of the scientific revolution, and going to great lengths to devise a new elaborate metaphysical scheme that would allow us to keep, God and the organic cosmos, even in the context of an increasingly mechanistic natural science. So, I think more highly of Leibniz than Stewart does, but it's a good book nonetheless.